you know, if there's high voltage there, you've got to wear the correct safety gloves, of course, and the personal protection equipment. You might even need to go ahead, of course, and wear one of these. So we might need to go ahead very simply and have a face shield on. Anytime we pull something off that's orange, that's able to supply high amperage, we have a scenario where, you know, there could be a arc. So that spark arc could go ahead and affect your eyes, etc. So it's very preferred, in fact, just about mandatory, to go ahead and ensure that you have some kind of face shield to protect from arc damage to your body. Because the arc is probably going to affect your eyes worse than anything. So, hey, no one wants to lose their eyes. So if you pull anything orange apart, make sure you're wearing the appropriate protection, of course. Let's go ahead and look at a couple things here. If we go to the PowerPoint real quickly here, we can see that there are the components that are under the frunk. Now, hey, what do we mean by frunk? Well, that's the front trunk. So that means it's the area that we see right here. And the Ford F-150, of course, has a very, very large frunk. Now, notice in the bottom of the frunk floor, there's all sorts of electric components and such. Those electric components, of course, don't do so well when you go ahead and bolt things through them and such. So never bolt or allow a customer to bring you something in to bolt to the bottom floor in this case. Because if you bolt to the floor with self-piercing, self-tapping screws that are rather long, you might find out that you're going to get some sparks, which aren't always a good thing, obviously. Now, we want to talk about if we got to service this thing. You know, hey, I don't know about you, but when I service things with gloves on, protective gloves, etc., it's hard to hold some of those small components and such. So there's times when you want to go ahead and service something and you're going to have to go ahead and disable the high voltage. So we're going to go through the high voltage disable for you, and we're going to do it as it's supposed to be done. Now, there is a guidance for it in the factory FDR scan tool. Unfortunately, right now, none of the aftermarket scan tools that I'm aware of do the actual Ford procedure. So we have to do it just a little differently with the aftermarket tool. So we're going to talk about it. Now, first things first though, this is a typical connector that's a high voltage disconnect off of, in this particular case, a Toyota. So we're going to use the Toyota connector. Why? Well, it looks pretty. So what we want to keep in mind here is we've got two very large terminal connections, if you notice right here and right here. These particular connections, if we have 400 amps on them when we pull them, that's going to definitely give us a spark arc. So anytime you have one of these style connectors and you pull it off, you've got to make sure that you have face shield to protect you from arc. Okay, pretty simple. So anytime you pull orange like this, now if you've done your job, there will be no amperage here. But if there's 400 amps here when you pull it off, you got to protect yourself from arc, as far as high voltage arc into your eyes, which could damage your eyes, which you don't want. So once again, safety protection. Now, the Ford Lightning does not use one of these. The Ford Lightning, you're going to actually disconnect a green connector that has 12 volts on it. So it's a 12 volt feed on the connector. That 12 volt feed, very simply, doesn't require that you use this. Now, regular safety items, such as goggles that you might wear in, of course, a shop environment, eye protection, and also any kind of other thing you might wear for protection in a normal shop environment is what you should be wearing. You don't even, to pull that off, physically need anything in a high voltage protection glove or anything, because it's only a low voltage source. Let's go ahead and go through how we're going to go ahead and do a disconnect. Now remember, this truck has no plug like this to disconnect to get rid of the high voltage, high amperage. So this thing doesn't exist. It's done. We've got a green connector, and we're going to talk about that green connector and where it's located at and such. So as far as this goes, we want to keep in mind in this particular case, we're going to get to that connector, and we'll show you what the connector looks like. Now, if you go to the PowerPoint in this case, there's our connector. You can see it in green. So that green connector is the actual disconnect for the high voltage contactor. So remember, it's low voltage though, it's only 12 volts. So let's get a look where that particular connector is, and then we'll show you how to use it to go ahead and handle things. So we're going to use our scan data also when we go ahead and go into here. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the positive contactor voltage. So in other words, how much voltage is coming out of the contactor into the system, because we're going to monitor that. Remember, the contactor is in the battery pack underneath the truck. So if the contactor has 0 volts going out, that means anything that's high voltage on the truck is no longer supplied high voltage. We're going to get rid of the high voltage supply out of the battery pack by opening the contactor. Then we're going to go very simply here and wait a certain amount of set time that Ford requires. So we go ahead and wait for all the modules to discharge their high voltage. Once that voltage is discharged, we're going to go ahead and be able to work on the high voltage modules on the truck, because the high voltage is now not there any longer. So you don't have to worry about the protection equipment at that point, or any kind of insulated tools or anything like that. But you must make sure that the high voltage is gone. So follow all correct safety procedures to ensure there's no high voltage if you're going after something without protection equipment. Now remember, if you don't know for a fact that the high voltage is gone, you always wear your safety equipment. Why? Because you're responsible for your safety. I'm responsible for my safety. I want to make sure if I'm not insured that I have no high voltage there, I'm going to wear protective equipment until I'm insured that there's no high voltage there. So let's get to it. We're going to show you where things are at, and let's go to the scan tool first. And we're going to go to scan tool first and then work it from there. So what I'm going to do is roll over here to the scan tool, and I'm going to go ahead and just put in their contactor. But I'm going to put in their positive contactor. Notice as soon as I hit positive, there's the main positive contactor status, okay? And there's also contactor voltage positive. So I'm going to go ahead and go on to contactor voltage. I'm going to choose that option. I'm going to look at the input status on that positive contactor also. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and choose these particular parameters. And then I'm going to go ahead and graph them as far as that goes. So bottom line here is we're going to go ahead and kind of handle this and then roll it from there. So here we go. Okay. So let's go ahead and we'll repeat that, but let's get over to the truck real quickly here. And right over here, there's a panel, and this panel has to come off first to get to the connector. So it's a quick disconnect panel. Now remember, you don't have to pull the whole frunk out. We're just pulling this panel. These clips basically come out, and they're plastic type clips that you're used to working with. So nothing special here. Make sure you take all the clips off properly and you're good. Lay this off to the side so you don't trip over it and such, and you're pretty much good to go. Connector is located right over here, as you can easily see it, okay? You can also see in the PowerPoint slide, that's what the connector looks like. Now, we're gonna go ahead and pull this connector off and show you how it works, but before we do that, we're going to go ahead and I want to review again how to go ahead and handle things on the scan tool. So we're going to roll back over to the scan tool real quickly here, and we've chosen some parameters in this particular case. So there's the 4 parameters I've picked. Now, I don't want to look at some of these, I've decided, so I'm going to go ahead and negate these 2 real quickly here, and I'm going to go ahead and definitely look at these 2 that I have here. So we're going to go ahead and do a graph on these, not a problem. And I'm going to go ahead in this particular case and look at the graph. And if you notice, as far as the graph goes, this one's fairly important for us right here because it's the contactor positive voltage. Now, if you notice the voltage right now, looking at the scan tool data, we're at 359 point whatever volts on the positive side. So we've got quite a bit of voltage coming out of the contactor positive. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and disconnect the connector. If you look at the PowerPoint picture, you'll notice that the green connector is shown there. Now, if you notice on the green connector, there's also a red tab that prevents it from going ahead and disengaging when we go down the road and hit a bump and such. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run over the truck and I'm going to push in on the little red tab. I'm going to get the lock off of it. Then I'm going to open that connector up. You'll notice when I open the connector up that basically there's a hole exposed. That hole is now going to go ahead and have a situation where I can put a tie strap or a lock through it, so that'll ensure that no one can come up there and push that connector back together. Because if they push it back together, you can guess what's going to happen to the high voltage. So we're monitoring the high voltage. So what I'd like you to do is I'm going to go ahead and pull it apart and then watch what happens to the high voltage when I pull it apart. I'll let you know when I've got it pulled apart and you'll see what happens to the high voltage. Notice I've got it on graphing mode because graphing mode usually shows things a lot quicker. So very simply put, we should see that high voltage when I pull it off drop down. Okay, so here we go. Back over to the truck. So I'm going to go over the truck. I'm going to defeat the red safety lock on the connector. I'm going to push in on the connector and I'm going to go ahead and pull this thing open. Now remember, right now we've got high voltage on the truck. Now, if you notice what instantly happened in this particular case is we have a situation where the voltage on the actual scan tool went down to what? Well, take a look at it. It's right down at 0. So our voltage is at 0 on the scan tool. So that means that when I pull that green connector off, that contactor actually physically opened up. So all the voltage now is in the battery. Now remember, there's one place you can't get rid of the high voltage at. And that one place you can't get rid of the high voltage at, very simply, is in the battery pack itself. So anytime you pull a battery pack apart, if you have a reason to do so, remember, most battery packs are serviced as a unit. But if you do go ahead and have to pull it apart, remember, you must have personal protection equipment on, because that has high voltage in it no matter what. You can't just eliminate that high voltage. The contactors keep the high voltage in the battery case, but kind of roll it from there. So that's how we do it to go ahead and handle it. Now, Ford tells us we need to wait 5 minutes. We wait the 5 minutes. You can see the contactor opened up immediately when I pulled the connector off, which is great. But we may have some capacitors and such in some of those modules that were powered up with high voltage that might have a scenario where they have some high voltage that's dissipating in those capacitors. So Ford says wait at least 5 minutes. So we wait 5 minutes. Once we wait 5 minutes, what will happen very simply is we have a scenario that the truck itself will now go ahead and basically be low voltage powered on all those high voltage devices that aren't in the battery pack, because we shut it off.